Qui è ora. Qui è dove conoscere significa confrontarsi con le sfide della contemporaneità, ascoltare le nuove generazioni da accogliere nel tempo presente. Ora, Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore. Visita il sito unicat.it.
E allora si è voltato improvvisamente alla gente che era lì e ha detto: la gente che cosa dice che io sia? Chi dice che io sia? E voi chi dite che io sia?
Qui è ora. Qui è dove conoscere significa confrontarsi con le sfide della contemporaneità, ascoltare le nuove generazioni da accogliere nel tempo presente. Ora, Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore. Visita il sito unicat.it.
Allora si è voltato improvvisamente alla gente che era lì e ha detto: la gente che cosa dice che io sia? Chi dice che io sia? E voi chi dite che io sia?
Civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Good evening, everybody. We're here for the encounter, the journey towards the essential in Cormac McCarthy. The title of the edition this year of the Rimini meeting, the 45th edition of the meeting, really comes straight from a phrase of this American author, Cormac McCarthy. If we're not after the essence, then what are we after? The idea of this evening's meeting is really to try and deepen this theme, going to following a path, a journey of readings in the books of this great American author who died in 2023. And we'll do it through a series of selections that will be read and commented in a dialogue between two exceptional authors, Stas Gawronski a television author and a teacher of creative writing in Rome, and writer himself, and Alessandro Zaccuri, a journalist and writer who's in charge of the communications at the Sacra Cuore University and writes daily on Avvenire, the newspaper. He's also written many novels. Let's go straight away. Let's get right into the heart of the question with the first page of the novel which came out in 2023, The Passenger. We'll start with this reading. It had snowed lightly in the night, and her frozen hair was gold and crystalline, and her eyes were frozen cold and hard as stones. One of her yellow boots had fallen off and stood in the snow beneath her. The shape of her coat lay dusted in the snow where she dropped it, and she wore only a white dress, and she hung among the bare grey poles of the winter trees, with her head bowed and her hands turned slightly outward, like those of certain ecumenical statues whose attitude asks that their history be considered, that the deep foundation of the world be considered where it has its being in the sorrow of her creatures. The hunter knelt and stogged his rifle upright in the snow beside him, and took off his gloves and let them fall, and he folded his hands one upon the other. He thought that he should pray, but he had no prayer for such a thing. He bowed his head. Tower of ivory, he said. House of gold. He knelt there for a long time. When he opened his eyes, he saw a small shape half buried in the snow, and he leaned and dusted away the snow and picked up a gold chain that held a steel key, a white gold ring. He slipped them into the pocket of his hunting coat. He'd heard the wind in the night, the wind's work, a trash can clattering over the bricks behind his house, the snow blowing out there in the forest in the dark. He looked up into those cold, enamelled eyes, glinting blue in the weak winter light. She had tied her dress with a red sash so that she'd be found. Some bit of colour in the scrupulous desolation. On this Christmas day, this cold and barely spoken Christmas day. In 2023, when the Passenger came out, this is the first page, I recall that I started reading the book and it was like receiving a slap in the face, because the reading Cormac McCarthy has this strength. It's as if a blow comes across you and makes you change your gaze and unexpectedly see things from a different perspective. He's not an entertaining writer, and if there's a void, if he'll open it to enlarge it. He's not a writer of evasions, because he brings you in territories that are disturbing, sometimes even ferocious. He's a writer of visions that helps us to penetrate reality and grasp it in all its mystery. This is a scene that hits you with an unheard of strength, because it's the image of a woman who hangs from a tree. In the following pages, we'll discover that we're talking about Alicia West, the protagonist of Stella Maris, of the following novel, a woman who had killed herself. And they're the hunter who'd by chance bumped into this woman hanging from a tree. The hunter has the intuition, has the perception to find himself in front of something sacred, and he kneels. And he says, in front of this statue whose posture contemplated history, that asks that the foundation of the world be considered where it has its being, in the sorrow of her creatures. So McCarthy uses twice this verb to contemplate, to look, to fix your gaze on something, on this disturbing spectacle of the hanging woman. And deep inside this abyss, there's a light that makes you come out of that comes out through the Litany of Loreto, a Marian prayer. So, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see a full room when we talk about literature. Even Cormac McCarthy isn't literature like we think about it. Indeed, as Stas said, don't think we're going to have an easy, cheerful evening together. But it's going to be an important evening, which is a different thing. So in this twisting, this slap that makes your head turn, automatically, McCarthy makes you, because from the way he is, from the way, if you read it in English, you see a load of jargon words. It's not something that we expect at first glance for a nice reading. It's already violent in its structure, but it constrains you to seek the essential. It constrains you in this page to look for the details. There isn't a complete description of the scene. There's an accumulation of details, some more significant than others seemingly insignificant. The red scarf, whatever, is made to make herself seen, but little things that we'll understand later on what they mean. And with this little bit of sleight of hand that he does, describing even in a bit of a rushed way, this page is a detail in the book. It's a page that the leader could almost forget right till the end of the journey that the passenger takes us on. And Stella Maris, when you recall this detail, then you'll understood that the essential is there, that there's something that talks to you. So let's look together at the essential. The invitation that I'll do to you is to not have the preoccupation of understanding everything while Stas Gawronski is reading the selections, but really to try and following the indications that we get from this seeing the hunter who kneels down. Really, let's listen. Let ourselves be struck simply without worrying about trying to follow what's going on, without trying to follow all the particulars. And so let's start this journey, this path, in the great literature of McCarthy. Stas, please. Who is the protagonist? So, taking the start of a book that's called Beyond the Borders, we see it, The Crossing. We see this great narration. McCarthy, between these two dates in 2023, he wrote 12 novels that can be read as a single story. In The Crossing, he says it's clearly all the stories are a single story. If you listen carefully, they're a single story. On a winter's night in that first year, he woke to hear wolves in the low hills to the west of the house, and he knew that they would be coming out into the plain in the new snow to run the antelope in the moonlight. He pulled his breeches off the footbed of his bed and got his shirt and his blanket-lined ducking coat and got his boots from under the bed and went out to the kitchen and dressed in the dark by the faint warmth of the stove and held the boots to the window light to pair them left and right and pulled them on and rose and went to the kitchen door and stepped out and closed the door behind him. When he passed the barn, the horses whimpered softly to him in the cold. The snow creaked under his boots, and his breath smoked in the bluish light. An hour later, he was crouched in the snow in the dry creek bed, where he knew the wolves had been using by their tracks in the sand of the washes, by their tracks in the snow. They were already out on the plain, and when he crossed the gravel fan where the creek ran south into the valley, he could see where they'd crossed before him. He went forward on knees and elbows with his hands pulled back into his sleeves to keep them out of the snow, And when he reached the last of the small, dark juniper trees where the broad valley ran under the animus peaks, he crouched quietly to steady his breath, and then raised himself slowly and looked out. They were running on the plain, harrying the antelope, and the antelope moved like phantoms in the snow and circled and wheeled, and the dry powder blew about them in the cold moonlight, and their breath smoked palely in the cold air as if they burned with some inner fire. And the wolves twisted and turned and leapt in a silence such that they seemed of another world entire. They moved down the valley and turned and moved far out on the plain until they were the smallest of figures in that dim whiteness, and then they disappeared. He was very cold. He waited. It was very still. He could see by his breath how the wind lay, and he watched his breath appear and vanish constantly before him in the cold. And he waited a long time. Then he saw them coming, loping and twisting, dancing, tunneling their noses in the snow, loping and running and rising by twos in a standing dance, and running on again. There were 7 of them, and they passed within 20 feet of where he lay. He could see their almond eyes in the moonlight. He could hear their breath. He could feel the presence of their knowing that was electric in the air. They bunched and nuzzled and licked one another. Then they stopped. They stood with their ears cocked, some with one forefoot raised to their chest. They were looking at him. He did not breathe. They did not breathe. They stood. Then they turned and quietly trotted on. When he got back to the house, Boyd was awake, but he didn't tell him where he'd been nor what he'd seen. He never told anybody. Who is the protagonist of this great narration of Cormac McCarthy? It's a man who's met the mystery. And here the mystery is incarnated in these wolves. Unexpectedly, this lad is called, but in the night, he goes up on the hill. He starts watching these wolves hunting the antelopes, and then he waits. He awaits them. The wolves arrive. He looks at them in the eyes, and something happens. It's as if that fire that was inside the wolves had met the fire, the desire of this young man, that from that moment would never be the same again. He comes home with a secret. He'll never say it to anybody, because from that moment he'd become a hunter of the divine. He wouldn't find peace until he could find the traces, the tracks of the mystery. So this is what happens, like in the Gospel of Mark, in particular, a miracle or a sign. Jesus says, "Don't to maintain vigil on our thoughts, on our actions, to let our desires surprise us. And so this secret that Billy brings back in with him is to have perceived a brotherhood with this slightly dark creatures. It's a threat that speaks to him. So all the books of McCarthy, in some ways, are stories of formation, and this moment, when he realizes he's not totally good, and so therefore he can become more good. So this is a great moment of formation and interior growth. So after this fundamental moment, this epiphany, the young man, the protagonist, makes himself, as you said, as a hunter of the divine. He follows up on what he'd felt burning himself. So help us understand what journey this is. First of all, let's say that it's a journey, that of the hunter of the divine is a man in whom there's a flame burning. There's a phrase, a section from Cormac McCarthy in All the Pretty Horses, where he says specifically this thing about the protagonist. What he loved in the horses was exactly which he loved in man, the blood and the warmth of the blood. All his esteem, his sympathy, all his propension went for burning hearts. Like this way. It always was like this, and it would always be that way. So the protagonist is a burning heart that puts himself on the journey, and he crosses a frontier. So this bit, coming from All the Pretty Horses, we'll see these boys on the journey. They followed out along the fence line and across the open pasture land. The leather creaked in the morning cold. They pushed the horses into a lope. The lights fell away behind them. They rode out on the high prairie where they slowed the horses to a walk, and the stars swarmed around them out of the blackness. They heard somewhere in that tenantless night a bell that tolled and ceased where no bell was. And they rode out on the rind dais of the earth, which alone was dark, and no light in it, and which carried their figures, and bore them up to the swarming stars, so that they rode not under but among them, and they rode at once jaunty and circumspect, like thieves newly loosed in that dark electric, like young thieves in a glowing orchard, loosely jacketed against the cold, and 10,000 worlds for the choosing. So they are young people on horseback who walk towards the frontier between the United States and Mexico. And here the author, the interesting thing is that he describes them not while they're journeying under the stars, but amidst the stars, as if their life was truly impregnated with mystery, immersed in the mystery. And what do they have in front of them? These 10,000 worlds to choose, 10,000 worlds for the choosing in front of them. They are two youngsters who live within possibility. They're open to what could happen, and for this they put everything in play, and they cross the frontier that naturally is a symbol of this desire to go beyond, a reality which is beyond reality. They leave something known to throw themselves into an unknown world beyond the frontier, with that trust which only a burning heart can have.
Anche il cuore ardente.
So even this, burning heart, the disciples of Amos, he didn't, it says this in the Bible everywhere, the theme of burning hearts. And Cormac McCarthy is a profoundly Catholic author, and then with that he's often had to grapple with his faith, as many people have, but he never forgot this, and these words kind of echo across his writing. These are fundamental words, and if we think about it, in effect, when do the disciples of Amos have a burning, to the Emmaus have a burning desire? Well, when they have they're still on the road, when they're on the frontier, at the crossroads. I don't know if you've read the letter about the value of literature, the role of literature in formation that the Pope published this year at the beginning of the month. In this letter, there's a passage that talks about this crossroads. He says that we should be careful, because it's not that readers through literature, through poetry, that they receive a clear, reassuring message. It's rather the opposite. That they're brought into a kind of no man's land, kind of an uncertain place where good and evil aren't clearly established from the beginning. And this is exactly what happens in McCarthy's books. He leaves it to the end as a surprise, but in reality, in these days in the meeting, we're meditating on the words of almost like a scammer. When he talks about the essential, he's cheating, and yet that's the most important thing that needs to be said. So the frontier, these crossroads, is something important. It happens to all of us. It's the situation that McCarthy's characters live in. It's an uncomfortable position to be in, and yet a very lucky one, a very happy one to be in, because only when you're at the crossroads of life can you take the step forwards that brings you home. I'm not stuck behind. I'm still on the journey. So, in this uncertain point, this crossroads, in which the two are walking openly, with between 1,000 worlds, what happens along this walk?
The hunter of the divine must face up to fundamental temptations. The first awareness that he must have, which escapes Billy, is that of being an orphan, you can't go in hunting the divine unless you're looking for a father. Outside of this relationship, there is no possibility to find what you've met that day, looking in the gaze of the wolves. And the person of the crossing along the way, they meet some other characters who try and put them on their guard and say, look, you're an orphan. For example, an old man came forward and addressed him in a Spanish that he could scarcely understand, speaking with great earnestness into the boy's eyes and holding his saddle fore and aft, so that the boy sat almost in his arms. He was dressed in odd and garish fashion, and his clothes were embroidered with signs that had about them the geometric look of instructions, perhaps a game. He wore jewellery of jade and silver, and his hair was long and blacker than his age would seem to warrant. He told the boy that although he was huérfano, he must still cease his wanderings and make for himself some place in the world, because to wander in this way would become for him a passion, and by this passion he would become estranged from men, and so ultimately from himself. He said that the world could only be known as it existed in men's heart. For while it seemed a place which contained men, it was in reality a place contained within them, and therefore to know it, one must look there and come to know those hearts. And to do this, one must live with men and not simply pass among them. He said that while the huérfano might feel that he no longer belonged among men, he must set this feeling aside, for he contained within him a largeness of spirit which men could see, and that men would wish to know him, and the world would need him, even as he needed the world, for they were one. Lastly, he said that this, while itself was a good thing, like all good things, it was also a danger. Then he removed his hands from the boy's saddle and stepped away and stood. The boy thanked him for his words, but he said that he was in fact not an orphan. And then he thanked the women standing there and turned the horse and rode out. They stood watching him go. As he passed the last of the brush wickiups, he turned and looked back, and as he did so, the old man called out to him. Eres, he said, eres huérfano. But the boy only raised one hand and touched his hat and rode on. So the boy meets somewhere along the way somebody who tells him the truth of himself. He says, "You are an orphan." But the boy is still tempted by what? Possessing the divine. This is the great temptation. Before putting himself on the journey for the wolves, seeking the wolves, he goes to meet an old hunter to ask him for some advice on how to capture wolves. And this hunter says to him, "Look, I've understood that you are seeking something else, because it's in a trap. What remains are the teeth and the skin of the wolf. But what you're seeking is something else. And what you're searching for is like a snowflake, a colpo de nieve in Spanish, that when you put your hand out and you take it in your hand, this snowflake, and you close your fist, it disappears. The mystery, you can't possess it." What is the other temptation that the orphan, the hunter of the divine must face? It's that which follows on from the disappointment of not being able to possess the divine. Look, that every day in marketing they sell us constantly that we can possess the divine. What is this temptation? That of believing that deep down there isn't anything, that there was an error, that it was a trick, a deception, that in front of us there's nothing, behind this there's nothingness. And so this person from the crossing says, he starts to wander around, tempted ever more by this temptation that nothing exists deep down in life.
So the essence has a certain level of predilection, especially it's well disposed to paradoxes, and we were talking about this earlier. This is a very paradoxical passage, the one Stas just read for us, particularly because this old man says some things that are very counterintuitive. The good things he says have a sort of element of danger, and it's that usually we think, the bad things are dangerous. The good things are good. They're nice. They're beautiful. What are you saying? Even Dostoevsky, when he says that salvation will save the world, would added something at the end on how much beauty can be terrible. So we should kind of remain in paradox. We must accept paradoxes and accept that the essence is present like something that we can't understand in an etymological sense of the word. So in this passage, there's an element that grows in McCarthy's work until it becomes explosive in his final novels like Passenger and Stella Maris. For many years, McCarthy lived in a scientific research center. He didn't love writers, he loved scientists, and it's the paradox of time is one that echoes throughout his work. He says, you young boy, you think the fact you're an orphan today will save you from the fact that you will be an orphan. This sense of now, later, today, it's this complex time web, and it's almost like us when we have these like when children have these moments of strange worry when when a child has a moment of wisdom, of millennial wisdom, of knowledge that randomly happens, and sometimes parents will hear this and think, well, what happened? What are you thinking about? What's going through your head? And there's a moment where every one of us, independently of their age, finds within themselves something childlike, and it can be a joy, a fear, a memory. Is time real? However how we measure it with watches and clocks, but our the way we understand the essence, this thing we reach out for these things we've experienced when on the day of our wedding day and our first love, when our children were born, and it remains there. It's always in the present. It's neither before nor after. And this passage kind of talks about the same thing. Today, tomorrow, yesterday. The important thing is that you live this experience, that you cross this frontier.
Malinconia di una certa stanchezza.
You were speaking of melancholy, of a sadness, a tiredness, that the word you were saying before, a nulla, a nothingness, this temptation of nothingness, of nullity. So McCarthy is known by many for the crudeness of his descriptions, for the crudeness of the observations that he makes on life. And for this, he's considered by many to be a nihilist writer. So how does the experience of evil enter within the journey of this protagonist of ours? The experience of evil in McCarthy is an experience of which we shouldn't take our eyes off. It's as if the reading of McCarthy, his literature, is a continuous invite to look in our life, to take the bitter cup of nonsense when it's in front of us, because deep down in that abyss, at the bottom of that abyss, there's a light. McCarthy makes me think much of this, of Mark Roszko, a painter you may have come across, who paints some canvases that are black, that emanate light. So McCarthy, this happens in him, that the reader reads even about situations that are more than extreme, super violent, of an unexpected, unbelievable ferocity. But the reader in some way is passed through by a mysterious consolation, because deep down in that obscurity there is the essence, the essential. The essence has decided to live deep in the abyss. The next section is taken again from All the Pretty Horses. With the last hour light enough by which to see the iron sights of the rifle, 5 deer entered the Bahada, and pricked their ears, and stood and then bent to graze. He picked out the smallest doe among them and shot her. Blevins's horse rose howling where he'd tied it, and the deer in the Bahadas leapt away and vanished in the dusk, and the little doe lay kicking. When he reached her, she lay in her blood, in the grass, and he knelt with the rifle and put his hand on her neck. And she looked at him, and her eyes were warm and wet, and there was no fear in him, and then she died. He sat watching her for a long time. The sky was dark, and a cold wind ran through the Bahada, and in the dying light a cold blue cast had turned the doe's eyes to but one thing more of things she lay among in that darkening landscape. Grass and blood, blood and stone, stone and the dark medallions that the first flat drops of rain caused upon them, he remembered, Alejandro, and the sadness he'd first seen in the slope of her shoulders, which he'd presumed to understand, of which he knew nothing, and he felt a loneliness he'd not known since he was a child. And he felt wholly alien to the world, although he loved it still. He thought that in the beauty of the world were hid a secret. He thought the world's heart beat at some terrible cost, and that the world's pain and its beauty moved in a relationship of diverging equity, and that in this headlong deficit the blood of multitudes might ultimately be exacted for the vision of a single flower. So it strikes me how this passage, I think that the world hid a secret, that the heart of the world was beating at a terrible price. that inside reality, the being is a wounded being. It's as if the literature of McCarthy is born from this gaze that's pointed, targeted at the cross. At the root of reality, there is a wound. Like he says in the first bit that we read, if you remember, that the foundations of the world should be considered and the suffering of its creatures. So it's like a fire that's within things has started a fire, the suffering of creatures, the travails that there are in each of us. There's the essence that McCarthy looks at and that his characters go and seek.
Nihilism isn't saying that evil exists. It's convincing itself that evil is irrelevant. It's like good. That reality in its light and its darkness doesn't have any meaning, doesn't matter. That it has got nothing to do with me. McCarthy's writings, his narratives, it says exactly the opposite of this. It says that everything has to do with me. Everything is relevant for me. Everything is a door, a path to the essence, to what's vital, to the joy and the suffering that's at the heart of the world. And I'd like to spend a minute on this and recall something that will bring us back to that first passage, the term of details. McCarthy's a writer who's very careful with material details, what objects are made of, how they're used, how moving it is for a human being when they use a tool knowingly and properly. It's almost as if it was a continuation of the principle of the incarnation. It's not just the body, but how the body exists in reality, how it exists in history, how it alters it, along with all the risks that this brings with it, obviously, because, one of the most famous killers of McCarthy's narrative, that he perfectly respects this narrative. He built his own rifle, and he massacres people with it because he made it very well, it's a question of ambiguity. I'm no longer a nihilist when I accept this ambiguity. When I say, yeah, all right, I don't care. What's it got to do with me? Does anyone care about that there's good or that there's evil? That's nihilism. McCarthy's exactly the opposite. It's a totally open sensitivity to all the good there is and all the bad there and the evil there is in the world, because it has something to do with him, because it has something to do with us. So this openness, even to what's bad, to what's evil, not just to what's good, but to suffering and to what's tiring, it seems like a condition that's inevitable, but that can be overcome. Like you said, starting from understanding that even that has something to do with me. It's relevant to me. But how does our protagonist, the orphan, cross and overcome this condition of evil?
For McCarthy, the orphan understands his condition in the moment in which he starts to listen. It comes about often in his novels that the protagonists stop and listen. Even in the midst of the road, in the road, the man is completely reduced to ashes and darkness. The father looks at this child, and he listens. And Alicia West, the woman we saw hanging from the tree in the first scene that we've come across, she has her own frontier. One day she decides to invest all the money that she'd inherited, all of her possessions, to buy a violin and to listen to this violin. When I got home, I sat down on the bed with it in my lap and opened the case. Nothing smells like a 300-year-old violin. I plucked the strings, and it was surprisingly close. I took it out of the case and sat there and tuned it. I wondered where the Italians had gotten ebony wood for the pegs, and the fingerboard, of course, the tailpiece. I got out the bow. It was German-made, very nice ivory inlays. I tightened it, and then I just sat there and started playing Bach's Chaconne. The D minor, I can't remember. Such a raw, haunting piece. He'd composed it for his wife, who died while he was away. But I couldn't finish it. Why not? Because I just started crying. I started crying and I couldn't stop. Why were you crying? Why are you crying? I'm sorry. For more reasons than I could tell you. I remember blotting the tears off the spruce top of the amati and laying it aside and going into the bathroom to splash water on my face, but it just started again. I kept thinking of the lines, "What a piece of work is a man." I couldn't stop crying. And I remember saying, "What are we?" Sitting there on the bed, holding the amati, which was so beautiful it hardly seemed real. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, and I couldn't understand how such a thing could even be possible. This moment of intimacy of Alicia West with the violin corresponds to the encounter that Billy had with the wolves. It's the beginning. It's the confirm of her search. Yes, the mystery exists. The mystery reveals itself. The mystery is able to touch us. The mystery, we can sense it, we can hear it, we can listen to it. And what is the fruit of this encounter with the violin? McCarthy insists on the fact that this woman cries. And even the doctor who's interviewing him asked her, "Why were you crying? Why are you crying now while you're telling me about it?" This crying is the fruit that the mystery gives to the hunter of the divine who discovers that they are vulnerable and so needing to enter into a relationship. It's as if the fragility, which is revealed by the crying, as if the weakness, the vulnerability, could be the womb in which the hunter of the divine, the orphan, finally can hold the mystery. It's as if for Alicia Weston, in the encounter in the passenger and in Stella Maris, that moment where this vulnerability came out, she starts a journey of stripping off, she decides bit by bit to let everything go. And this letting everything go is letting go away a person that she'd understood that they couldn't possess the divine, but can receive it by losing one's own life. Only losing your own life can you receive that which our desire pushes us towards, to go on a journey, to cross the frontier, to go through evil. Only this awareness can bring us to this denuding ourselves. And this, about her own life, Alicia West says this: she says to the doctor who's interviewing her. I thought that I would go to Romania, and that when I got there, I would go to some small town and buy second-hand clothes in the market. Shoes, a blanket. I'd burn everything I owned. My passport. Maybe I'd just put my clothes in the trash. Change money in the street. Then I'd hike into the mountains. Stay off the road. Take no chances. Crossing the ancestral lands by foot. Maybe by night. There are bears and wolves up there. I looked it up. You could have a small fire at night. Maybe find a cave, a mountain stream. I'd have a canteen for water for when the time came that I was too weak to move about. After a while, the water would taste extraordinary. It would taste like music. I'd wrap myself in the blanket at night against the cold and watch the bones take shape beneath my skin, and I would pray that I might see the truth of the world before I died. Sometimes at night the animals would come to the edge of the fire and move about, and their shadows would move among the trees, and I would understand that when the last fire was ashes, they would come and carry me away, and I would be their Eucharist, and that would be my life, and I would be happy. So what is the happiness which Alicia is looking at? It's the happiness that can happen only by offering one's own life, by giving oneself away. So, as a meal, they would have taken me away and I would be their Eucharist. Only in giving oneself as food do you find the divine of which the violin revealed, and then for which she crossed the frontiers. It's beautiful, this passage too, when it says that after a while the water would taste extraordinary. It would taste like music. The taste, the mystery has a taste, a flavor.
Particolarissima configurazione.
And the very particular mind of Alicia, there's a way what's called synesthesia. She has this condition where for her, music has a smell, colors have a taste. It's as if she's experienced another kind of reality, another level. And Alicia is a very tough character in reality. This, I say this just so we can understand that there's, how can I say, kind of compensation there's a level to Cormac McCarthy. He's got a strange sense of humor, Cormac McCarthy does. These two protagonists in The Passenger and Stella Maris, they're called Western, their surname, much like he wrote many westerns in his time. And Alicia, and it might even seem like a parody if you know these types of sketches where there's a psychologist, a doctor who makes that noise. Every now and again he's forced to say something about himself by Alicia. It's called Cohen, like the two brothers, the directors who created that film. There's a lot of kind of small plays on words that he does, and there's also the kind of things that authors get to bring across through their literature. Alicia quotes Shakespeare, but what a shame that Shakespeare's quoting the Psalms. So it's a sort of double quotation. So we see how there's a whole sort of continuous sense of language being used, and it's sort of technically quite similar, on how the how a violin works, but there's a technical, but there's also very precise language, very exact. There's not another words that Alicia could use to say Eucharist. That is the Eucharist. There's no other word that you could use. You know, much like how the tool you use to tune a violin is very specific, does a very specific job. There's a similar level of precision in the language used and that the characters use. You know, many of these characters also speak Spanish, or they speak a very strange English, or sometimes even in a sort of an English with broken grammar. They say ain't instead of isn't, or instead of I'm not. And yet the word is always right when they use it. In the context that you least expect, the right word always comes, and it gives this sense of essence, and sometimes that could be the word Eucharist. In this journey, is there a moment in which the orphan finds their father?
Maybe you've read the novel, the Road, the Crossing, because it's the most known by Cormac McCarthy, the one which won the Pulitzer Prize. And in that novel, in The Road, finally the orphan stops being that, because he enters into a relationship with the Father. He enters into a relationship with the divine. The paradox is that with respect to the other novels, nature has stopped speaking. Before, the characters crossed the border, the frontier, went over the plains with the sky that pulsated, and this echoed their desire for the infinite. Now, unexpectedly, the earth is reduced by an unexplained catastrophe to nothing. Dark, ashes, cold. But what remains is that we follow for the whole novel is the relation between this father and this son, who drag themselves dirty, tired, alone, cold, through this earth, where the only fire is that which they bring in their relationship. And so the orphan finally finds the divine because it's entered into a relationship with the Father. With the first grey light, he rose and left the boy sleeping and walked out to the road and squatted and studied the country to the south, barren, silent, godless. He thought that the month was October, but he wasn't sure. He hadn't kept a calendar for years. They were moving south. There'd be no surviving another winter here. When it was light enough to use the binoculars, he glassed the valley below, everything paling away into the murk, the soft ash blowing in loose swirls over the blacktop. He studied what he could see, the segments of road down there among the dead trees, looking for anything of colour, any movement, any trace of standing smoke. He lowered the glasses and pulled down the cotton mask from his face and wiped his nose on the back of his wrist and then glassed the country again. Then he just sat there holding the binoculars and watching the ashen daylight congeal over the land. He knew only that the child was his warrant. He said, "If he is not the word of God, God never spoke." They passed through towns that warned people away with messages scrawled on the billboards. The billboards had been whited out with the thin coats of paint in order to write on them, and through the paint could be seen a pale palimpsest of advertisements for goods which no longer existed. They sat by the side of the road and ate the last apples. "What is it?" the man said. "Nothing." "We'll find something to eat. We always do." The boy didn't answer. The man watched him. That's not it, is it? It's okay. Tell me. The boy looked away down the road. I want you to tell me. It's okay. He shook his head. Look at me, the man said. He turned and looked. He looked like he'd been crying. Just tell me. We wouldn't ever eat anybody, would we? No, of course not. Even if we were starving? We're starving now. You said we weren't. I said we weren't dying. I didn't say we weren't starving. But we wouldn't. No, we wouldn't. No matter what. No matter what. Because we're the good guys. Yes. And we're carrying the fire. And we're carrying the fire, yes. Okay. It's a dialogue that says everything of this relationship between the father and son. The son is he who generates the father, generates the orphan, who seeks continuously to bring the father to be merciful with the others, with the other poor people that they meet along the road. It's him, the son, who asks for assurance, saying, but we're the ones who bring the fire. And what is this fire? It's the sense of life. Where can this thing live? Only in the relationship between father and son. And McCarthy says clearly, when he says, if he's not the word of God, then God had never spoke.
He'd understood that the boy understood that he could be the wolf. And in fact, the father tells him that we're the good guys, not that they're good. We've chosen to be on that side. And it's true that the father generates the son, but the father must also accept that he was generated, he was created. Sometimes we look at the kind of father-son relationship that's from the most relatable experience, which is that of being a son. Not all of us are fathers. And we've always got something to kind of reclaim. There's that one time, you preferred, you had one preference one way or the other, and you can't get out of this thought process once you go down that road. You can only get out once you accept to become a father. I didn't really know anything about what happened before this journey, this part in a desolate world, but we know that something irreparable happened, and we know that in this family, where there's a boy, the father decided to remain and be a father, but the mother didn't manage. The mother's a very tragic character. She didn't manage. Not even love was enough. Not even instinct was enough. And so the father became a father. And only when the father accepts that he's become a father, then he's no longer an orphan. So much so that even at the end, when the boy apparently finds himself alone, there's a word that the father said, that his father said, that he recalls, and that's something that in the Italian translation wasn't done properly. English, you have to study it to understand this Nebraska language that's used. You do it to understand, people like Shakespeare, people like McCarthy, other authors like that. And the father on this road, when his mission's coming to an end, and he knows he needs to hand over the boy to someone else, he says in the Italian translation, goodness will think about it. It's very consoling to think about goodness. In English, it's 3 words. Mercy will come. Mercy is Mercy is much bigger than goodness, it's much wider. Will refers to the future. You're an orphan. Will is a secure future, 100%. And come, it's coming like someone, like a person. It's not something abstract. Someone is coming. And have you read the road? If not, I won't spoil it. But whoever was meant to come does end up coming. In the end, that devouring need, in some way that becomes fulfilled, as opposed to the word of God that some maybe has become a bit too big for this world. There's the breath of God at the end. Yes, right at the end. So we've come to the end of this journey. But what is the destination? Where are we coming to in this journey?
The destination is the fire, is that essence which burns in the heart of all things, and which manifests itself, reveals itself in the relation between the Father and the Son. The Father says to this child, I have you. These two are, for each one, the world for each other. The Father repeats, I have you, because he's reached the extreme limit, that the orphan, the hunter of the divine, has reached the extreme of his condition. It's as if we, at the end of our life, when we can't grab onto any other thing, we would say, I have you. The fire is the symbol par excellence in McCarthy. It happens in all of his novels. There's a particular description which comes from Blood Meridian that I want to read. They made camp on a low bench of land where walls of dry aggregate marked an old river course, and they struck up a fire, about which they sat in silence. The eyes of the dog and of the idiot and certain other men glowing red as coals in their heads where they turned. The flames soared in the wind, and the embers paled and deepened and paled and deepened, like the blood beat of some living thing eviscerate on the ground before them. And they watched the fire, which does contain something within it, something of men themselves, inasmuch as they are less without it, and are divided from their origins, and are exiles. For each fire is all fires, the first fire and the last ever to be. Among these flames, McCarthy says to us, it's as if there was like the pulsation of some living thing eviscerated. Once again, we have the wound. At the center of the fire, there is a wound. A living being eviscerated, hung on the cross. They all looked at the fire that has in itself something of men themselves, because without it, men are less, and separated from their origins, divided from their origins. This origin, for the orphan, the hunter of the divine, they've sought for all of their adventure. And he says they are exiles. Without this fire, we're strangers. Without this fire, we're irremediably orphans. And then we enter this relationship with this fire, which is the first and the last. Or otherwise we remain alone, subject to temptations that could make of us devourers of man. The hunter remains a hunter. But if he doesn't turn his gaze towards the fire, he risks to become, and he does become, and McCarthy says it in a very clear way, he becomes a devourer of man.
Siamo in fondo.
So, we're at the end. At the end now, I wanted to kind of circle back to something I spoke about earlier, about where this phrase comes out in The Passenger. It appears in one of the last pages, right at the end, when this character, Bobby, who in kind of a different way, he finds a sister who he sacrifices everything, he's lost everything, and he tries to have some visions, to be visited by some other characters. There's a very particular character for those who will read the books, and you won't forget it. It's Kid, the kid who's a kind of bit of a monster. He's very eloquent and very wise, but he insinuates a lot of things. And there's the fact that Bobby is visited by a friend of his who's died, and his friend is called John. It's a recurring name in McCarthy's books, a very simple name. A friend who was a great kind of con artist. You know, he was a real professional. He was very proud of himself. You know, he was a bit of a snake oil salesman. And people like that have a great market in the USA. You know, they always go and pay with someone else's card, and this was, despite this, he was a very kind of well-mannered, very knowledgeable man, very well-educated, but quite troubled by himself. And in the end, in this final dialogue, very improbable, impossible, paradoxical dialogue, almost outside of time, you know, one's dead, the other isn't. He tells them this strange sentence. We're not going in for the search of. He calls him, Messa. He asks him, what are we looking for? What are we going to do? And this is a great lesson, because sometimes we think that listening is only owed to those. Listening to someone is only owed to those who deserve it, when in reality it's wild, it's unpredictable. He speaks in whatever language he wants. He speaks the language of truth in that moment, and it speaks through whoever he wants. There's he who knows people who know beauty, who know truth through beauty, through suffering. There's people who find beauty in suffering. But it's completely unpredictable. And in fact, it's already present in other parts of the of his works. But in Stella Maris and The Passenger, the final two, this idea of quantum physics, of science, is very present. It's very clear throughout. And it's true that, we all need a father. We all invoke a good father. But if your father was one of those who built the A-bomb with Oppenheimer, would you still be sure that your father was so nice or so good? And that's a question that these orphans, not orphans, brothers, maybe not brothers, carry with them. The essence surprises us, and this is perhaps the best piece of news you could receive. So you said quite rightly that in the original, this essence they use the word essence in the original, and in fact, I think that this afternoon you've helped us to enter into the title of the meeting that we've opened today, to try and understand that the essence isn't a kind of contradiction, isn't the opposite of superfluous, but rather it's an essence, this fire within you that's at the heart of everything. But it's not abstract. It's not abstract at all, and it has the precision that you've reminded us of, even in details, and the concreteness. Through this theme of existence becomes incarnate. And so this search, this longing has come across quite clearly tonight. So looking back to the original in English, in which he doesn't say searching, but be after. To try to, at the heels of, to follow something. If this journey that we've been talking about tonight has begun from something our protagonists found within their heart and that drove them, then it's not kind of a random searching that we put into our heads, but it's following something that's already there, following something that comes before us and that attracts us. Before concluding here, I'd like to say two things. The first thing is that all of us can give a decisive contribution to the meeting, to this great human adventure, even particularly through donations across the whole meeting. There are dona ora points, and we know that the meeting only can operate thanks to donations. And the second thing is that, given that tonight we wanted to let Cormac McCarthy speak, I think it's only right that we let him conclude this.
Ogni tanto la donna.
She would talk to him sometimes about God. He tried to talk to God, but the best thing was to talk to his father. And he did talk to him, and he didn't forget. The woman said it was all right. She said that the breath of God was his breath, yet though it passed from man to man through all of time. Once, there were brook trout in the streams in the mountains. You could see them standing in the amber current where the white edges of their fins wimpled softly in the flow. They smelled of moss in your hand, polished and muscular and torsional. On their backs were vermiculate patterns that were maps of the world in its becoming, maps and mazes, of a thing which could not be put back, not be made right again. In the deep glens where they lived, all things were older than man, and they hummed of mystery.
Civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Qui è ora. Qui è dove conoscere significa confrontarsi con le sfide della contemporaneità, ascoltare le nuove generazioni da accogliere nel tempo presente. Ora, Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore. Visita il sito unicat.it.
E allora si è voltato improvvisamente alla gente che era lì e ha detto: la gente che cosa dice che io sia? Chi dice che io sia? E voi chi dite che io sia?
Qui è ora. Qui è dove conoscere significa confrontarsi con le sfide della contemporaneità, ascoltare le nuove generazioni da accogliere nel tempo presente. Ora, Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore. Visita il sito unicat.it.
E allora si è voltato improvvisamente alla gente che era lì e ha detto: la gente che cosa dice che io sia? Chi dice che io sia?